Will the first fatality since 1975 along India and China's disputed border leave lasting scars? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Beijing and New Delhi toning down rhetoric, announcing talks after Monday's high-altitude clashes in the Himalayas that left 20 dead on the Indian side, with the Chinese People Liberation Army silent on its own casualty toll. Both sides insist no shots were fired. So what did happen in that remote region that is part of what's known as the rooftop of the world? In many ways, the leaders of the planet's two most populous nations speak the same language, you might say. Both Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi are transactional leaders. They're pragmatic, but also both nationalists, intent on projecting strength. At a time when coronavirus has citizens the world over second-guessing orders from above, neither wants to appear weak. And when India and China square off, well, the dispute draws in territory that touches everywhere from Myanmar to Pakistan, not to mention outside players. As India draws closer to countries like the United States and Australia, could the whole planet get drawn in? Today in the France 24 debate, we are asking if it can escalate between China and India. And with us to talk about it from Mumbai, Samir Patil, fellow at the International Security Studies Program at the think tank Gateway House. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We're welcoming from Singapore, Yogesh JOSHI, research fellow at the Institute for South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here.
France 24 Beijing correspondent Charles Pellegrin is with us from the Chinese capital. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
And she's a senior editor at France24.com here in Paris. Leela JACINTO is with us from the French capital. How are you?
I'm good.
All right, good to hear it. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Yeah, both sides toning it down now, but it was pretty tense on Monday when that news first broke of 20 casualties on the Indian side. Monty Francis has more.
Sitting with their son's portrait between them, the parents of Colonel Santosh Babu expressed their grief and shock to learn of his death, one of 20 Indian soldiers killed in clashes with Chinese forces.
We are under deep shock on hearing from my son's misfortune. Never expected, because it is not new to him for working in such difficult places.
The deaths were met with protests in western India, where demonstrators burned the Chinese president in effigy. The casualties come as the result of a long-held dispute over a border in the western Himalayas, a focal point of conflict between India and China since a war between the two countries in 1962. The two nuclear powers both claim large portions of territory along a remote frontier that runs for 3,500 kilometers. Indian and Chinese troops who patrol the border are under strict orders not to fire their guns. An Indian army source says no shots were fired and the deadly violence was hand-to-hand. The Chinese accused Indian soldiers of crossing into their territory, while India said its troops were there to discuss efforts to ease tensions between the two sides. Indian media are reporting several soldiers fell off a cliff during the battle and drowned in a river below. The Chinese government would not comment on reports of casualties on its side, but in a sign of growing tension conducted military drills in Tibet. Military officials said dozens of Indian troops were missing, apparently captured by the Chinese.
Samir Patil, any news of those missing Indian soldiers? And have you been able to piece together what probably happened?
So as of now, the government and the army has clarified that there are no missing soldiers and all the soldiers have been accounted for. So that actually puts rest to all the speculations that there were some people who were missing in action. Now, in terms of exactly what happened, I think broadly speaking that on June 6th, there was a meeting between the two countries' military officials where the disengagement process was decided. and there had been a planned disengagement which was undergoing. On this particular night, the Chinese were in one area which India has claimed as its own territory, and the Indian party went to this particular location to check whether the Chinese have actually disengaged from that location. And there was some scuffle which happened, and then the fighting ensued. And as the report clarified, that there was actually no fighting, but most of this was hand to hand. And now we are hearing some reports that some weapons were used. I mean, some weapons as in like sticks and those kind of things have been used by the Chinese PLA to beat the Indian soldiers. So I think that's what exactly broadly happened.
Do you believe, Yogesh Joshi, that no shots were fired?
I believe so. For last 45 years, the last time shots were fired was in 1975 on the eastern sector. But for last 45 years, no weapons have been fired. But also that the 1993 border, peace and tranquility agreement, as well as subsequent agreements after that, have made both Chinese and the Indians abjure physical violence, including use of firearms. So there has been a precedent for that. And there has been a precedent where scuffles have happened, skirmishes have happened, even physical jostling, but disengagement has happened. The problem over here was once political decision makers have taken the decision to move back, the disengagement procedure requires trust and verify. And the Indian soldiers went out there to verify whether the Chinese have pulled out their troops as well as dismantled their tanks. They didn't expect, because of the terms of engagement for the Indian military are pretty clear. Even when fisticuffs happen, you don't have to engage in physical violence, especially firing of shots. And that's what happened.
Let me ask you about that. Yogesh, because you have this photo that was tweeted by an Indian army colonel who's a defense analyst, Ajay Shukla, which shows nail-studded rods. Now, again, neither you or I were there. Does that seem plausible that this was used?
Yes, very much. You can see the blood stains on the sticks as well. I think the uses of Neanderthal weapons, which involve these clubs studded with sticks, batons, and fisticuffs. And the Indian soldiers were carrying weapons. The External Affairs Minister has just tweeted that the protocol requires you to carry weapons, but not to use them. And there is where the Indians basically lagged. They were not expecting this, both because of the protocols as well as the history where both sides have maintained the sanctity and confidence in not breaching and imposing physical violence on each other. There has been no casualty on the border for 45 years. And this was completely unexpected, and therefore it is so shocking. And also, let me add, the terrain is very difficult. Once these fist fights occur, most of the deaths actually occurred because soldiers were pushed or either fell into the ravine, as well as the sub-zero temperatures which are there in the Galwan Valley and the river flowing through that place. So because of the fisticuffs, a lot of series of things happen, and that's why you see the death toll to the numbers we have today.
So you heard Charles Pellegrin, Yogesh Joshi describe the timeline there. May 5th, there's that first fist fight. Then it seems to have de-escalated. Indian soldiers go towards the border, and there's a skirmish there that takes place on Monday with what we've just described. What's the version you're hearing where you are?
Well, there's a lot less communication about this incident, this clash here in China than in India, first and foremost, because India's press has been covering this a lot, and Chinese state media has kept this under wraps or tried to, or just really states very bare facts about this. But the official version of this incident, of this clash that's been presented by the authorities here and by Wang Yi in particular, the foreign counselor, is that India crossed the line of actual control and violently, I'm quoting him here, violently attacked Chinese soldiers who were approaching them. So we're having almost two versions of reality here, two distinct narratives about what happened there. And that might come down to the fact that neither India nor China can agree on where this line of actual control is. So a very different narrative here in Beijing.
Is it something that's being, as you say, suppressed in the state media? Is it being talked about, though?
It's hard to get a gauge of popular opinion and what's being talked about in China, but it is a topic of conversation on Weibo, and it's not necessarily being censored, but it's not being covered by state media in the sense that it wasn't the front page the day after the news was made, and it wasn't covered extensively either. And this is a deliberate strategy on behalf of the authorities here to not blow this out of proportion, to not fan nationalistic anger towards India in order to be able to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, for the second time in as many months, both sides going public to, as they put it, tone it down.
भारत शांति चाहता है, लेकिन भारत उकसाने पर हर हाल में यथोचित जवाब देने में सक्षम है।
中印双方正通过外交和军事渠道就解决有关问题进行密切沟通。当前中印边境地区形势总体是稳定的、可控的。中印双方都表示致力于通过对话解决分歧，维护边境地区的和平与安宁。
Now, the difference between the first two incidents, Leela, JACINTO, is that this time there were actually fatalities. When you listen to those remarks, do you think that, well, that's it, we're going to now go towards appeasement here?
Well, I want to emphasize that this is, that border skirmishes are not new, but we are in uncharted territory right now. These skirmishes lasted well over a month, as opposed to earlier ones that happened at strategic points. In terms of the international climate and what's happening, things have also changed. We are now in the sort of a coronavirus era, which is much more dangerous. So yes, there are,
much more dangerous. How so?
Well, as you said, Francois, if you look at both countries and the world in general, you have populist leaders. You have populist leaders in India and China. The coronavirus crisis has exposed how badly populist leaders have handled the crisis. What generally tends to happen when the Ministry of Administration is not worked on, you tend to have a problem, and then there's a rallying around the flag. For China, Charles can talk about this in greater detail, but President Xi is under pressure. His populace is angry with him. And what the wolf warrior diplomacy, which China unleashed a few years ago, has really exacerbated, and on all fronts. In Hong Kong, there was the National Security Act, which is being pushed through without Hong Kong's green light, on the South China Sea. So China is starting to sort of respond to this overwhelming international pressure by asserting itself. And what happened on the Indian side, I feel, is a new game. And I feel that this needs to be looked at in a much broader scale. In the short term, certainly these border issues need to be resolved. But there are much bigger issues, the regional issues, that also need to be addressed. Because frankly, if we de-escalate, which we should right now, there is no guarantee that these incidents won't happen again.
No guarantee they won't happen again. Do you agree, Samir, that the current climate, the world context, makes this standoff more dangerous than it would be normally?
I mean, because of the violence, it has certainly been more dangerous. But I think right now, I don't see this as escalating, primarily because of the fact that talks have been going on both at the ground level between the military officials in Ladakh, where the violence happened, as well as between the diplomats. So foreign minister spoke to the Chinese, the Indian foreign minister spoke to the Chinese foreign minister. And there has been a constant communication between the two sides, where both the sides, as the report showed, are trying to tone down the rhetoric. of course, domestically, if you see in India, there is a lot of anti-China sentiment. Not just, I mean, it preceded the current crisis. It started actually with the fact that China's attempts to gain the foothold in the Indian neighborhood, as well as the entire handling of the COVID-19 outbreak, and the fact that the people's argument that China actually hid the virus from the world, and therefore they have to. Everyone now has to face the consequences. So I think there is that domestic anti-China sentiment which is there, but at the leadership level and at the military level, they're trying to contain the damage. So I think
but can I say, Samir, let me ask you this, because this is an area where those skirmishes took place on Monday, where India suffered heavy losses in the 1962 war. How much hurt pride is there on the Indian side?
So I would say, let me put two arguments. One argument is that obviously, if you just look at the deaths of the 20 Indian soldiers and the scores of injuries, that itself has created a lot of the anger here in India. But at the same time, if you compare it with the casualties on the Chinese side, there are unconfirmed reports which say that more than 40 casualties have been there on the Chinese side. If you look at the chatter on the social medias in China, in Weibo and all that, they're talking about injuries and fatalities into hundreds. So if you compare that, I think there will be some, I would say, scaling down of that anger, because just in terms of the relative terms. Obviously, if you look at the 1962, there is that hurt anger which is there. And but we have to remember that this is not the India of 1962, neither is China of 1962, and so are the militaries.
Charles Pellegrin, the Hong Kong-based newspaper, the South China Morning Post, quotes sources close to the Chinese army, one of them saying, as in India, the nationalist sentiment in China is escalating, with some social media platforms belonging to the military political departments pledging to safeguard Chinese territory by all means. That brings us back to what Leela said about China flexing its muscle at this time, not just at its border with India.
Absolutely. This has been kind of one of the hallmarks of Xi Jinping's tenure at the head of China ever since he came to power here now in 2012, 2013. He has this whole vision of what he calls the China dream, a dream of national rejuvenation, of restoring China to a certain form of former greatness that he has in his mind, of where China should be in the world. And that translates in making strong territorial claims. And we're seeing that on the border with India, with China flexing its muscles there, but all over. We're seeing it with Taiwan, where Xi Jinping has said that he's not excluding reuniting with Taiwan by force if necessary. We're seeing it now with China asserting its control over Hong Kong and ramming through this national security law that's actually being examined by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress as we speak. And we're seeing it as well in the South China Sea with this construction of these artificial islands to make their stake there. And these are things that have been happening even recently. In the last few weeks, there's been such things as the Chinese military intercepting Malaysian and Vietnamese vessels in the South China Sea. We've seen this new security law in Hong Kong, and we've also seen sailing aircraft carriers sailing through the Taiwan Strait.
All right, and on the other side, you have really a tale of two Indias, Yogesh, Joshi, because on the one hand, it's a nation that was one of the founders of the non-aligned movement that prides itself on never having had any territorial ambitions beyond its borders since independence. And on the other hand, you have a nation that's revamping its military. We saw at the beginning of this month a new security deal that involves cybersecurity and the military with Australia. India, which more and more, again, wants to project strength.
As so far as the national interests are concerned, I think India is a status quo state. Even when we have lost more than 80,000 square kilometers of territory in the 1962 war, India has been ready to accept mutual, compromise on the territory. And the fact is that the Indian strategy vis-a-vis China is defensive. It just wants to maintain the status quo of whatever we have. yes, the Chinese power has increased dramatically, and so would be the India's military capability as well. Insofar as the point of aligning with the West and the whole issues of aligning with countries like Japan and Australia, the so-called Quad in the Indo-Pacific, the
And the
point
United
is,
States, I should add.
and the United States, so to say, but India has to maintain those options, particularly because the asymmetry of power has increased over a period of time. In 1980s, the force ratios of the Himalayas were actually in favor of India. By 2000s and late 2010s, the kind of infrastructure development in Tibet, as well as the modernization of the PLA military, kind of puts India on a backstage. So in fact, you have to develop those options. But India's strategy, I would still say, is much more of internal balancing. Use these relationships to create both military and economic capability. And that's what India has been doing. But this forces India to rethink its options. In fact, Chinese have done great disservice to themselves. If they wanted India to stay non-aligned and maintain its strategic autonomy, they should actually settle down the border. And then there is no point about India aligning with anyone. But they haven't been doing that because the fundamental point about Chinese strategy, grand strategy, is aggrandizement of power as well as the Chinese revanchist aims, to use a French term actually. So that if that is the grand strategy, then virus or no virus, the coronavirus has provided a tactical advantage, so to say, and it would have created an environment where the Chinese political leadership might be feeling weak or strong. But the experiences of the past clearly show that Chinese strategy is of salami slicing, expanding its territorial claims, and making much of its political influence.
But could you say the same in that case when India decides to lift the autonomous status for Kashmir, which is also, by the way, right next to where this is all happening?
I would say, of course, there is a domestic politics angle to it. It kind of serves, the purpose of the Hindu nationalist government in India. But it also allows India to basically project both to Pakistan and China that it is not going to do the same mistakes that it's done before. And it also allows India to kind of go ahead with its military buildup. So there is definitely a domestic politics angle, but there is also a very strong security argument for doing what India did.
Leela, JACINTO?
Well, I think what I am seeing is India it has traditionally, and there is reason for this, separated its issues and likes to handle things bilaterally. I want to emphasize that this is sort of a new era. The Beijing that we have now is not the Beijing that was in the 1990s and even in the 2000s. The fact that and the Beijing's playbook has always been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And on the ground, they get the strategic advantage. But they always play it below the radar. So it doesn't come into a full confrontation level. The problem is that on the Indian side, as you mentioned, the Kashmir status, it sent a signal to Pakistan.
Let's just remind our viewers here, Leela, last August, the Indian government decides to lift the autonomous status of that disputed region.
It did. So Kashmir as well as Ladakh, this is the area where we are seeing the current problems with China, is now under New Delhi. It's under central government control. When this happened on August 5th, China reacted very strongly and very quickly. And China is has very close relationship with Pakistan. And what happened to Pakistan is that this jump-started the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is a big part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So there's a lot of signaling. And what's happening is that this is a region in which 3 players are vying for influence. China will see any sort of, power gains that India made that needs to be controlled. So what happened in Kashmir and in Ladakh is very critical to how we have to de-escalate the situation. I fear that the normal New Delhi ways of handling the crisis, which is necessary for the short term, is not really going to address the long-term problems.
Yeah, because you talk about, Leela, three powers. You mean China, India, and Pakistan?
Yes, I mean, and there's you cannot compare China and Pakistan as border
Because can
countries.
I add a fourth one in this mix, which is the United States of America? Now that we have under Narendra Modi this closening of ties to the U.S., which had been in the past a closer ally of Pakistan.
Well, certainly the Trump administration is absolutely targeted at China, but I think from New Delhi's perspective and Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump have been getting very close, and that will not make China happy. But India has always had to manage all these players because it has a nuclear armed neighbor. It's got two nuclear armed neighbors. So I mean, New Delhi can be very good at leveraging Washington as well as Beijing. But there is no doubt that these growing ties and military cooperation between Washington and New Delhi has upset China, and this could well be seen as a move by Beijing to show India, where the balance of power needs to be.
Charles Pellegrin, we were all watching very carefully because there was this meeting on Wednesday in Hawaii between the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his Chinese counterpart Yang Jiechi. Appears to, in the end, have been a kind of a low-key affair, no big bombshell announcements, and certainly no mention of this border dispute.
Absolutely. There's both statements coming out of that meeting in Hawaii, both very curt, very short. But that meeting lasted 7 hours. But it's not clear what was accomplished during that meeting. If anything, it seems like it was just a way to keep the communications channels open between Washington and Beijing at a time when arguably the relationship between the two countries has been the worst since the Nixon years. I mean, it's really frayed relationships on many different fronts. So the Indian border dispute is only just one of the topics of conversation that must have been breached between Mike Pompeo and Yang Jiechi, who's basically the top Chinese Communist Party official in charge of foreign affairs. But again, the China will know that they have this neighbor on their southern border in India that has close relationships with Washington and is now part of this so-called Quad, along with Australia and Japan, that's supposed to be countering Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region.
Samir Patil, the fact that India has, under Narendra Modi, drawn closer to the United States, does it change the equation when you have a border dispute like the one we've seen here between India and China?
As I think Yogesh said, I think the very fact that China's aggressive behavior over the last few years has really then pushed India in the ambit of the United States camp, even though it's not a former treaty ally. If you look at the evolution of the India-US defense and security relations, if not the economic, you would see that that India is actually is like almost like a major non-NATO ally. So in that sense, it is the Chinese aggressive behavior, it is the Chinese revanchist behavior which has actually driven India into the US camp.
Driven India into the US camp. Is there a danger that with some misunderstanding, I'll put the question to you, Yogesh, JOSHI, this could all snowball and draw in other countries?
I would say that India is not going to be a US camp as of a formal treaty ally, so to say. Now, to begin this analysis, one must understand that what India needs. First of all, being nuclear power, both of them with nuclear powers, there's not going to be a major war. That is out of the question. What India needs is to basically deter Chinese from a limited war and basically capturing Indian territory. Now, Indian defense forces are sufficient enough. What India needs are to grow its capabilities, both economic and military, which is the latent capability India has because of the growing asymmetry in China. And that has been India's strategy. The trend in Indo-US relations, the growing Indo-US relations has been secular. This is a secular trend since 1990s. Chinese aggressive behavior is aggravated. But fundamentally, I don't think that there will be a formal treaty alliance with the US. And what India needs is smart diplomacy to get what it wants, as China did in 1970s from the US, and got everyone talking about the global liberal order and basically thinking that China would someday become, just like other democracies. And actually, Chinese power grew. The relative Chinese power grew on the shoulders of the West. And today, we need some kind of a balance. As Indian former Foreign Secretary said, the world needs a balance. And the US would, for the meantime, provide it. But at the end of the day, nobody's going to fight each other's wars. That would have to be done by the states themselves. And I think India is more than ready for it.
Speaking of, India is more than ready for it, you're saying?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because your interests are not about taking on territories which China has already held. And your strategies are defensive. And the defensive strategies in mountain warfare provides you ample amount of military advantage. Definitely, India has a lot more, military deterrent capabilities, both conventional and nuclear. The only thing India needs is to grow both economically and get more and more equipment and technologies from the outside. So in terms of holding the Chinese at bay, that's what India did, and that's why the Chinese are pissed off right now, sort of to say.
Leela, JACINTO, you agree?
Well, actually, I think that the signaling from India has actually signaled weakness. One of the things about these latest skirmishes was the lack of transparency and the lack of information. So literally on my Twitter feed, which is full of military experts, there was a lot of speculation, a lot of Indian media reports, but nothing coming out from the government. On the one hand, that is understandable because the government cannot really give strategic details so that negotiations can take place. But on the other hand, by saying nothing and, the contrast between Indian belligerence with Pakistan and the way all the problems with China was just not being addressed publicly and was open to speculation, actually signaled that India was very much on the defensive and, caught on the weak foot, literally. On the ground, there is absolutely no doubt that China is gaining territory. As for a full-out war, we have only had one case of a full-out war, which India lost. So,
But as you've heard the other panelists say, that was a different India and it was a different China. 1962, we're talking about it's a long time ago.
It is extremely long time ago. Things have changed much more dramatically, I would say. I mean, I shouldn't be comparing, but it's changed much more dramatically in Beijing under Xi Jinping. Beijing's standard playbook has been thrown out. While as India still has, in terms of foreign policy, it still has, a historic way of addressing these issues. But the game changer is really Beijing, and it has a strategic military advantage. It also has, the asymmetrical advantage, because it's tied with Pakistan that has, the asymmetric advantage of jihadist destabilization. So India really has two hostile neighbors in this northern border.
There's one country we haven't spoken about. Talk about being caught in the middle, and that's Nepal, the mountainous state. Which is wedged between India and China. Yogesh, JOSHI, right now there's a government that's on paper more sympathetic to China. How does Nepal play this?
For the time being, I think the communist government under Oli basically would, ratchet up the anti-India sentiment, and much of it is also due to the Indian diplomacy, and the way Indians have kind of dealt with Nepal. We have not been able to settle these border disputes for so long. So it's a wake-up call for India as well in South Asia, as Leela, rightly mentioned. But much of the rancor in Nepali approach towards India is out of this deep-seated, pent-up anger, but also because of the domestic politics, the polarization of domestic politics. And you can see how polarization in domestic politics actually can be both advantageous and sometimes can be of great disadvantage all along the South Asia. So the fortunes of India's relations with its neighbors actually depends upon the domestic politics going on, and whether we saw it in Maldives or in Sri Lanka. So I don't think it's a very big problem for India. If the Indians decide to settle it at some point in time, that would be fairly easy. But the domestic politics again intervenes. India requires both sincerity of effort as well as right intentions to kind of sit together and settle these disputes. And given even when there is a growing economic penetration of Nepal, but I think there is a huge history between India and Nepal which can't be forgotten, and the kind of interdependence which India and Nepal has. The requirement is right Indian attitude. That's what I would say.
Very briefly, because we're running short on time, Samir Patil, you agree?
Absolutely. Even India and Nepal have a very different set of dependency. And I think one point that I'd like to highlight here is that I think the differences on the border between India and Nepal, I think both the countries should have handled it in a much more mature manner. And I believe that I think the differences propped up by Nepal are certainly maybe not at China's behest, but I think the communist government there is pretty sure that it will be backed by China if the push comes to the shove.
Will be backed by China. So if you have, Samir, Nepal, and as was just mentioned by Yogesh, Sri Lanka, where sympathies waver one way or the other, what should Narendra Modi do?
I always say that because India is geographically such a large country in the Indian subcontinent, that no matter how much magnanimity that India will show, there will be always these smaller quibbles which will come up from the neighbors. But I think India has to play the role of elder brother rather than big brother, and continue to make sure that it delivers on the promises that it has made to these neighbors. Domestic politics obviously will play its role in making sure that the different regimes will play both India and China to each other. But I think if India is on the path of making sure that it is able to deliver what it has promised to the neighbors, I'm sure that India will be able to have these countries in its ambit or the influence.
One final question before we go. I'll put it to you, Leela JACINTO. During this show, we haven't shown many images of the areas where the actual skirmishes took place. It's so remote, this area. Again, remind us, what are we fighting over? What are they fighting over?
Well, they're fighting over the line of actual control, and every time this happens in the press, we have these cliches of the Himalayan heights and rocks and snow. But if China is actually trying to push the line of actual control, where to both the militaries know the border posts, they know what the area is. So yes, it's almost it's very picturesque to talk about hand-to-hand fighting and soldiers plunging into icy rivers. But these are territories, and just do not forget that these are two nuclear-armed Asian giants, and India has a lot of problems which it should not have with its other neighbors. But China has always been the one partner that has very geostrategic influence in the region.
Leela JACINTO, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our correspondent Charles Pellegrin in Beijing, Samir Patil for being with us from Mumbai, and Yogesh JOSHI from Singapore. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's more on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.